Hola amigos, bienvenidos a Visión Periférica. This is my second English interview, and today I am joined by Jason Snyder, who is an adjunct professor at Appalachia State University in Sustainable Development. How are you, Jason?
I'm great. Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be here.
Nice. All right, wonderful. So I wanted to have you on because I want to talk about agriculture, and specifically, I'm interested in the topic of sustainable, ecological agriculture.
Yeah.
I know that there's also permaculture and regenerative agriculture, so we can go through all of those.
Yeah.
Um, but the first thing I wanted to ask you about is the way people understand modern agriculture, because the way the world has become MBA-fied,
Yeah.
as citizens, we're basically forced to understand what's the best course of action based on an Excel spreadsheet or like some graph.
Right.
And so one of the things I wanted to ask you about is oftentimes people say that we need modern industrial agriculture because we need the highest yields possible. Like uh, the world has many people and there's only so much land you can use, so you need to make the best out of that land,
Yeah.
right? And so that's why we need to use fertilizers, pesticides, all of these things. So like what
Mhm.
is wrong with that vision?
Well, first off, it's simply not sustainable. Um, the amount of topsoil loss that we're seeing. I mean, there's estimates depending on the area and the region that we maybe have like 50 to 100 years of harvest left before we lose all our topsoil. And basically, no matter how many chemicals we put into the ground, it'll just the crops will get worse and worse. It's especially like large monocropping agriculture. We lose biodiversity. You've probably heard of like the pollinator crisis. The bees are
Mhm.
dying. This is both due to decreasing biodiversity, but also the chemicals that affect the bee populations in ways that we don't really understand. A lot of the soil runoff that's so it's running off, and which is bad because it makes it harder to grow food. We're not cultivating a living biology, a microbiology, but it's going into the oceans. It's contributing to like ocean dead zones, eutrophication downstream, things like that. And also there's a climate component as well. Current kind of practices, a lot of the carbon dioxide gets released in the atmosphere with the practices, where it doesn't belong, right? It's causing climate problems for us. Regenerative agriculture, like the core of regenerative agriculture, is building up the soil again, and part of that is sequestering carbon, actually, like bringing the carbon back from the atmosphere into the soil. So there's just several environmental aspects that I just don't think we can continue for the foreseeable future. But I think there's also cultural aspects as well. For me, like driving through the countryside, like driving through the Midwest, it's severely depressing. You have these large, humongous farms. A lot of the owners, oftentimes don't have that much autonomy anymore. There's they're perhaps funded by investor groups. They're severely in debt. They have to keep kind of getting bigger and getting bigger, and in order to just keep up and pay off their debt obligations. And this is in contrast. You said you had read the book by Wendell Berry, Unsettling of America. Maybe perhaps you might say this is kind of a bucolic or kind of an old-timey vision, but when we had smaller farms in the past, that produce more diversified types of goods, not monocrops, and it just had a lot of intangible cultural benefits to that. A lot of like festivals and various parts of the season, or celebrations that revolved around food harvesting. You had more, I would say, resilience and self-sufficiency, right? Because if a lot of the farmers, say in the Midwest, they have to go to the supermarket to get most of their food, right? Because they're producing one crop, and so they're not actually resilient. If global supply chains broke down, they would be in a lot of trouble as well, and so the rest of us. And so there's
Yeah.
also the supply chain issue, and being, dependent on global supply chains, being fragile, not having, a diversified food supply within our region, I think is also quite concerning. And so I could go on and on about this, but
Yeah,
I
of
think there's
course.
many problems with it.
Yeah, no, and you touched on many issues that I wanted to talk about. So for people to visualize this, because the thing is, like, there's many layers to the problem, and I think it helps with like talking about certain effects. So
Mm.
you said that a lot of farmers, they're into a lot of debt, right? And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but really, agriculture, the way that it used to be, it was actually quite friendly with the environment. It's just that it required a ton of labor, right? And so nowadays, the fields have become increasingly mechanized, and the reason we use monocultures is so that it's basically easier to automate, the harvesting of the crops. Um, However, this also means a lot of fragility for the farmers because they need to get into a lot of debt in order to do their jobs.
Right.
um, what is the reason for this need for increasing consolidation in the size of farms?
Well, I mean, so this is a product of many developments in the 20th century, but there was, especially after World War II, there was an attitude, just a general attitude in the culture that to adopt the spreadsheet model of efficiency, getting more efficient, and people agriculture. So kind of like this idea of structural transformation. Um, um, you know, uh, why as to why did that happen? I mean, so there are undeniably some business advantages to larger farms, right, and to larger mechanized farms, right? You make um, higher profits, perhaps, if you're not getting, a lot of farmers went out of business trying to consolidate, get more mechanized, and they ended up going out of business. And the percentage of the number of farms I have today is much lower than we used to have, right? So it didn't work for a lot of farmers, but it did work for some farmers. And so there is there is a certain business logic to it. If you're thinking, but I would say if you're thinking in a very kind of narrow lens that doesn't consider the externalities, right? The environmental externalities, also future generations, again, how we treat the land. Um, Now, that said, there's not actually a land productivity relationship to getting larger. There's an empirical regularity around the world that smaller farms tend to be more productive. They are more labor intensive. They're not they're not high in productivity in a labor sense, but in a land sense, right? And so there is somewhat of a trade-off. If we're a society that doesn't want to farm, if farming is a low status profession and we want to get out of it, well, then perhaps we want the model we have today, but it's not it's not going to last long, I don't think. But I think that we need to find some kind of balance. I think there is some advantages to mechanization, right? So I don't think we necessarily want to completely revert to the most kind of basic technology of the past, digging your garden with a hoe. And I mean, I do that, but I enjoy manual labor, but I wouldn't expect that for everybody. But so and there is a lot of new technology coming online that is kind of built for smaller scale. There's a whole kind of DIY, what's called cosmo-local kind of movement where it's producing kind of like tractors for like smaller farms and harvesters and things like that. And so I think we can retain some of the benefits of technology, right? So it's not just going to the past, but I just think it's a kind of a Faustian bargain to get that extra margin of profit for a few farmers, at the expense of everything I talked about before about all of the problems. And so I'm not saying it's like a clear cut, it's very nuanced, and there's trade-offs. There's always going to be trade-offs, right?
Yeah.
But again, why did everything move in the direction it did in the 20th century? Like why did we all move to suburbs, right? It seemed convenient. It seemed like that was the American dream, right? All of that stuff. And it seems like now a lot of people are waking up and realizing, actually, like, this is miserable. Like, this is really, it's ugly. It's very energy intensive. Along a lot of metrics, it's not sustainable. I think there's a growing sense that we've lost something, and we need to recover some of it.
Yeah, yeah. So I actually had a question on specifically the use of pesticides, because oftentimes you can even argue that, say, the use of glyphosate can make agriculture a little bit more sustainable, in that, you don't need that much spacing between crops if
Mhm.
they're all glyphosate resistant, right? And so you might argue that you may reduce some of the soil erosion. Um, However, I think really what happens is you shouldn't focus so much on the details. You should focus on really the properties of the system, which is, you know, even if you go vegan and you avoid meat at all costs, most of agriculture still needs a lot of fossil fuels just to be able to function. And so,
Yeah.
like, you can always make adjustments and make things a little bit more sustainable. But I mean, eventually, we're not going to be able to keep on using monocultures and, pesticides and artificial fertilizers, etc. And so, but before we go into specifically like agroecology, um,
Mm.
I wanted to ask you something. So, if we were to compare, say, what we now call organic agriculture to local farming to, you know, agroecology. So, like, what is the difference between these three uh, uh, types of agriculture?
Yeah. So a lot of it is sociological. So, like, people ask, like, what's the difference between permaculture and agroecology? And I think a lot of it's sociological, like different movements, but there's a lot of crossover. So organic just means, like, organic is kind of like the lowest bar. Like, it just means you're not using kind of chemical pesticides and fertilizers. Like, that's basically all it means. Agroecology is a more holistic idea that you actually want to cultivate biodiversity in the system. And instead of say, using organic kind of pest killers or something, you want to attract the species, say the predator species, that will take care of your pest problem or something like that, right? Or instead of, you know, I don't know, applying some salt, some substance to the soil to get things to grow for one season, you want to actually build up the soil over time. So there's more microbiology. There's, mycelium network that, increases bioavailability to your crops. And so I would say agroecology is a kind of a more holistic idea of, you know, you want to work with nature in order to, um, you know, both provide habitat for various species and animals, but also to get good yield as well. Because that's, as humans, that's what we care about. We want to eat, right? So it's, I would say it's organic, but it's kind of, like, you can get organic certification without really thinking agroecologically, I would say.
Yeah,
And then
and
local is a whole other, local is all about scale, right? And so, in terms of the whole larger regenerative ag movement, there are certain people, like there's a podcast, Regenerative Agriculture podcast by Jack Kempf, and his whole thing is he's just trying to get large scale conventional farmers to, adopt more regenerative practices. So, for example, planting cover crops in the off season in order to prevent topsoil loss, to sequester nitrogen, or to plant hedgerows or windbreaks, or like riparian zones, or intercropping, right? Things like that, but on a large scale. But then there's other people, and I fall into this latter camp, where, who argue that actually we need to localize agriculture quite a bit. Actually, decreasing the number of, disintermediation of the food system, making direct connections between producer and consumer, um, bringing people closer, to the sources of their sustenance. And, there's just a lot of kind of socio-political, cultural, I would say, benefits to localizing agriculture. Um, I don't, I think it would ultimately, it would have to be some kind of mix. Like, I think there is some, arguments for scale in some settings, in a more regenerative type of sense. But, my ideal vision is like village economies, small towns surrounded by, with people, growing gardens and, peri-urban agriculture and, just beyond the kind of the city or village boundaries, you have more kind of the extensive agriculture, the less intensive agriculture, stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. So I wanted you to illustrate something which I think is a very nice paradigm, which is
Mm,
the idea that you can have zero input agriculture,
hmm.
right? Because
Yeah.
we have currently separated the different elements of a farm, right? Like we have separated the animals from the crops. So
Yeah.
like how would you explain to someone, right? Like why is it that, in traditional agriculture, like there's basically no waste on any end, right? I mean, I guess other than human labor, but
Mm.
um how do you attain that? How do you attain that in traditional agriculture?
Right. Well, so, there's this whole concept of kind of like closed loop economies, and this is what you're talking
Mm,
about. So you need to find a way to control pests, and you need sources of fertility, right? And so the question is,
mm,
how do you do that without pesticides and chemical fertilizers? Well, um, you know, again, traditional agriculture is a lot more agroecological than conventional current agriculture, right? And there's a lot of wisdom kind of embedded in that. I would actually recommend a book called Farming for the Long Haul, where it traces out kind of the whole history of kind of how traditional agriculture, there's a lot of wisdom in terms of maintaining fertility of the land, and being very resilient, and operating under very harsh conditions and doing still pretty well. But there's kind of like the low hanging fruit, right? So composting, if you're integrating animals into your system, they produce manure, that gets integrated back into the soil, as well as kind of, so basically all of the biomass and all of the waste ideally would get reintegrated back into the soil, right? So like for me, for example, in the fall, my deciduous trees, they dropped all of their leaves. I raked all that up. I used it for mulch, which helps the soil. Um, in terms of like no inputs, like that's, to me, that's a longer term goal. Like even the people who are kind of into permaculture, like they still, like for example, they'll still order soil to make their raised beds, or they'll order wood chips to provide mulch, right? And if ideally, you would have trees growing on your own land and you a wood chipper, of course that requires technology, which is not necessarily a thing, to create your own wood mulch, to over time you wouldn't need to bring in soil. So a lot of people on the more pragmatic end of agroecology permaculture say, okay, look, in order to get a system started, you really do need to have inputs, and you need to use fossil fuels. Having a chainsaw can be very handy, right? Stuff like that. But over time, the system should be more and more self-sufficient. It should become, it should approach, it's kind of asymptotic. Like you're approaching this goal of kind of a, like zero inputs and everything gets recycled back in the system. Another thing I would say is that there's kind of a, in the alt ag scene, there's people who emphasize more perennial agriculture. So people say that like we should be moving away from annual crops and towards perennial crops. And an advantage of that is that you don't need to kind of re-prepare the ground and everything each year, and that can deplete the soil, and really you want to like grow fruit and nut trees and berries and like perennial vegetables, stuff like that, and then maybe have animals integrated into the system. And animals can be very beneficial to the system, not just in terms of manure, but also in terms of like rotational grazing, and that can have benefits to the soil that way. And that, people argue that it's easier to move towards a kind of zero input system, in moving in a perennial direction, because again, perennials, once you get them in the ground, they're there for anywhere from a few years to hundreds of years, right? But I'm kind of a mixed approach guy. Like I think I think diversity in all aspects is good. So like I'm personally at my homestead, I'm I'm planting hundreds of trees. That's the goal. I'm in the process of planting like hundreds of trees and bushes, but I'm also having an annual garden, and I also have chickens, and maybe we'll get ducks, and eventually maybe we'll get larger livestock. But I'm not zero input right now, but it's something to work up to. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So
And
tell us
one
about,
more
yeah.
thing I would say is that
Mhm.
I don't know if zero input at a single small farm or homestead scale is necessarily desirable either, right? Like I think it would be desirable at like a local level, like say again, this
Mm.
thing of like the idea of a town, a village, or a bioregion. Um, I do think that food, you know, food self-sufficiency, not necessarily, doesn't mean that you won't trade, you won't import coffee because you love to drink coffee and it doesn't grow there. But, for your basic kind of like core, food that you need to survive, sufficiency at a larger level, I think is good. Like if my neighbor owns forest land and I'm able to go into his forest land and get, branches in order to create mulch, I don't think that's necessarily problematic, right?
Mm. Yeah. Right.
So it's all about determining at which scale do you want to try and create this circular system, and doing it at the individual scale is not necessarily ideal. I think either for either just ecologically, but also like in terms of community. Like I think developing patterns of kind of interdependence with your neighbors and stuff is also important, right? Like being connected and you know, helping each other when necessary and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I wanted to ask about something else. So
Mhm.
in your case, and the case of your neighbors and the people that you know, is the regulatory framework affecting you guys? Because I've noticed that there's a lot of government regulation of, like everything implicitly needs to be really like high scale,
Yeah.
because you have all of these like extreme controls that really get rid of a lot of the localized problems that you might have, but it also really drives up the cost to the point where it favors the like big production. So what's the regulatory, you know uh like what's regulation like for you guys? And also, you know do you have access to any kind of subsidies, or on the contrary, like do you have difficulty funding your operation?
Yeah, I mean, so me personally, I haven't had any issues, but I'm also, we've just surpassed our first year. I'm not, I'm not seeking in the short term to be a market gardener to make to make an income at it. And so I think in that case, the regulations are much less burdensome because I'm just on my own plot doing my own thing. You know, this issue of regulation, I know for like market gardeners and small scale farmers, like it's a really big issue. And you're right that a lot of the regulations are made, perhaps they were made with good intentions, but they were made to, with a much larger scale in mind, to be, with standardization in mind. And people have argued that the larger, operations, you know, contributed to the legislation, right? Helped to
Yeah,
write the
of course.
legislation because it benefited them. It took out their competitors, their smaller scale competitors, right? Because it was easier for them because of their scale advantage to meet all these regulations and get rid of the competition in the meantime. There's a lot of like, things people talk about. Like if you live in a suburb, you want to have a garden, oftentimes there's these neighborhood organizations that, if you don't have like perfectly mowed lawns, your neighbors will report you or something, or like they won't, your neighbors don't want you to have chickens. I understand if in the suburb your neighbors don't want you to have a rooster, like that seems perfectly reasonable to me. But then, people talk about like, for example, milk, right? Like if I want to like buy raw milk from my neighbor, depending where I am, that might be illegal. A lot of this stuff varies, place to place, county to county, and all of that. And so I definitely think that there needs to be an overhaul of the whole regulatory framework. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any regulations. Like I think there's food safety, play a little bit of role. Like that is, there is a little bit of concern there, but we've gone way too far with regulations. And most of them, a lot of them are outdated, or they were written like decades ago and no longer make sense.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. So for so let's say for people who are interested in becoming somewhat more self reliant, I mean,
Mhm.
we know that there's all of these problems, right? And in the past, I have heard you talk about what they call the minimum. Um, I forgot what my minimum viable, like minimum
Yeah,
viability. Um,
right.
so if people want to be more self-reliable, or they want to reduce their waste, do you think a good place to start would be to have your own chicken so that you can feed them your organic garbage?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a great article that I would refer to people. I'll do the link in the show notes. He's a construction guy, a friend of mine, and he has a great article on like how can you be more resilient at kind of the individual and kind of town or community scale. And so there's a lot of things you can do. I mean, I think food is the low hanging fruit, right? It's hard to be, of course, it's impossible to be more self reliant in like computers or digital technology, right? Like I'm not going to make my own computer; it's never going to happen.
Mhm.
But in terms of and that's also an argument for localizing food, is that as an individual or as a community or as a town, if you're more self reliant, you're less fragile, right? Like if bread baskets around the world fail, you still have your own kind of local source of food supply. Um, chickens. We got chickens this year, and it's pretty straightforward. It's not very difficult, right? Like,
Mhm.
the hardest part is like if you want to make your own chicken coop, like building it, but that's a fun project.
Mm.
It's not too hard to figure out. Uh, and of course, the we're not reliant in terms of like we still have to buy feed, right? We have to buy chicken feed to feed them, and that reduces vulnerability. But going back to this, like over time, decreasing inputs. Over time, I would like to grow the crops that would
Mm.
also be used for feed, right? And so, but that's a longer term kind of vision. But yeah, I mean, being able to like have your own, we have more, I eat like a couple eggs a day, I usually eat eggs for breakfast. We have more eggs than we need. We ended up giving, we usually end up giving some away pretty regularly, which is also very gratifying, right? To have
Mm.
more than you need and to share. So that's definitely something. In terms of, another thing, is food preservation. So you can grow a lot of food, say in the summer, but there's like 6 months out of the year or 4 months out of the year where you can't grow food.
Mm.
And so if you can preserve food, get into like canning or jarring stuff that you can store over the winter. Have some kind of cellar or larder or something where you can like keep potatoes or
Mm.
onions and kind of various staple crops that if things were to break down, you at least have enough calories to get you through. Yeah, and so I think growing your own food, I think most of us aren't, even who call ourselves homesteaders, like we'd be deluding ourselves if we thought we were totally self-sufficient in terms of food.
Yeah.
Like I'm certainly not, right? Like I'd hope to be like maybe like I don't know, 75% self-sufficient, or maybe 50% self-sufficient within 5 or 10 years with food, and then the rest of it I would get locally. I would buy locally from like local farmers and stuff like that. To me, it would be the ideal. Of course, in terms of self-sufficiency or self-reliance, there's many other things to think about. Like there's energy, there's water, and these are all other things that we could talk about if you want. But food is
Yeah.
to me is like the easiest way to get into, like even just growing your own tomatoes, growing your own herbs, just like if you just want to get started with something, feel like you're on a
Mm.
trajectory, moving in the right direction, planting a few seeds, on your windowsill is the easiest way to start, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. What about a CSA subscription? I mean, are those like? I mean, I'm currently a member of Hungry Harvest.
Mhm.
And I've actually read mixed things about this because I've heard that it may not be as eco-friendly as you think. So I'm actually thinking of switching to CSA. But I guess I need to look into that because I want to make sure that they're actually local farmers, right? Like I want to make sure they're
Yeah.
not bringing stuff from, some other continent.
Yeah.
Um, so I think finally, um,
Yeah, I'm a fan,
like
by the way, just to interject, I'm a fan of CSAs, farmers markets, also, you know, cooperative, like supermarkets, stuff like that. Like all of that, I think has to play a role because I just think it's not a realistic view of society that we're all going to grow all of our own food, right? Like if everybody, if half the population could grow 25% of their food and the rest they mostly got locally, maybe, so if 90% of their food came from themselves or locally through CSAs, through local, or direct relationships with farmers, right? Like you might strike up a relationship with a cattle farmer and, buy meat in bulk, right? And store it in a chest freezer, right? And then you have meat for the whole year. Like if we can get 90% of our food locally or through our own provisioning, I think that would be ideal. And then, the rest, like, spices and coffee and sugar that I can't get here, I wouldn't die if I didn't have it, but it's nice to have, we could import that.
yeah,
To me,
yeah,
that would be the goal.
yeah. So you've also touched on, the sociological aspects of, relying, on your local food chain. But on top of that, we've also talked about how in modern agriculture we have sort of separated everything, right? And so everything needs a ton of inputs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I also want to ask you about, how you like the process of being self-reliant and, like growing your own vegetables. Because from what I see, this is also, something you find deeply rewarding, right? Like in a way, you're also living your life in a more integrated way. I think so. There's this. I just wanted to share something. There's a very. It's a hilarious book, but it's also very insightful called "The Systems Bible" by John Gall, and he says that the energy of the universe with an A
Mm-hmm.
remains constant. Basically, what he means by that is over time, life doesn't really get any simpler. Like we only replace one problem for another. And so the way people live their lives now, everyone has become hyper specialized. And so
Yeah.
if I'm very good at coding, I'll be sitting all day writing code, but then, I'm getting out of shape because I'm sitting all day. And so then I have to go to the gym to compensate for that. And then, I don't spend enough time with maybe my family. So then, I need to do more.
Right.
And
Right.
so I wonder if you had any, like, do you have any thoughts on, how living a more integrated life has, uh, affected you personally?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly satisfying. Again, like this is our first year. We don't really know what we're doing. Like we're reading a lot of books and watching YouTube videos and kind of figuring out as I go along. I usually do something, and then when I'm halfway through, I read about it, and I'm like, oh, I did that wrong. Oh well, I'll do the second half of it, more correctly. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I used to be very compartmentalized, much more compartmentalized in my life, and I don't think it's really healthy. Um, you know, in terms of like just the man, I've realized that I really enjoy manual labor. Like it's just really good for my mental health. Like every day I try and get out and do at least 30 minutes of like chores around outside. If I'm not working on like a project, like building a hoop house or a chicken coop or planting trees or something like that, or making raised beds or something like that. Um, it's there was an existential angst, I would say, before in my life that is no longer here. Um, and I do think it has to do with, all of the cliches are true, like being closer to the land, working on something, having a labor of love and seeing a direct result from it. But also seeing like, okay, like that could be done better, that could be done better, like getting instant feedback, and which, provides kind of like, you know, kind of instant modification over time. Like there's something really rewarding about that. That's not, when in kind of this hyper specialized economy, like say we're a coder, you said, or I was, an academic, I was right, I was doing like research to put into policy reports and stuff. Like it's all very abstract, and the impacts of that were not very tangible, right? And what that was doing to my mental health is it's very nebulous. It's really hard to put my finger on it. But yeah, I definitely, I definitely think it's true. I mean, in general, I do think we need some specialists. Like, for example, a doctor. Like, I think, a doctor should mostly be a doctor, right? Like, they should specialize in doing surgery. I think that would probably be a good thing. But overall, I think as a society, we become too specialized, as Wendell Berry argues, right? Like, we should, in general, I think we should be able to do many things, right? There's a quote, I don't remember who, but like, specialization is for insects, right? Like, we're
Pardon me?
not insects, we're what's that?
What's the quote?
Specialization
Specialization.
is for insects.
Oh, okay,
Insects.
got it.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and so, and part of the problem with specialization is that it's fragile, right? So if you're a coder, and all you know how to do is code in one like programming language or something, and there's some kind of system disruption, there's some kind of, supply chain breaks down, there's a really bad pandemic, the energy grid goes down, and you don't know how to do anything like with your hands or anything practical. That's not a very good place to be in. It doesn't feel very good. You're quite vulnerable. And so, I think to be, a full human being, I think we need to have kind of a full integration of our body and mind as well, right? Like, a lot of us are disconnected, and like you said, we're on the computer all day. It's very mental. There's kind of this disconnect between the body and mind. And now, like, again, I try and spend at least like 30 minutes outside, and oftentimes like two or more hours outside during the day. Even this winter, I was getting antsy, and I went out and started digging a pond, right? Just because I wanted to do the manual labor with a shovel, right? And it felt really good. Like, this whole winter, I hardly felt depressed because I was outside every day, like digging a hole in the ground, right? And it was great.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
The thing is, even within the medical community, being
Yeah.
overly specialized has issues of its own, because let's say that a patient suffers from chronic pain. I might give them a painkiller that will affect their liver, right? But like, I'm not a liver doctor, so I might just do it because like, my goal is to decrease their pain, right? Like, I don't really care about the long-term consequences.
Yeah.
The way that I like to think about it is, if you have a kitchen at a restaurant and the chef is supposed to wash the pans that he uses, he's going to use a lot less,
Mm.
right? Because if there's someone that will do the pans for him, right, then he'll actually use a lot more. And so I think
Right.
really a lot of the wastefulness that we currently have is really part of this specialization, where you just do your thing and you optimize your own metric, and then you don't really you're basically shielded from the consequences of all of your externalities.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, there's some kind of balance here. In our podcast on the side view, Joe introduced this term. Well, he was describing, and I think I coined it, minimum viable capability.
Right.
Which is basically this idea that I'm not necessarily going to be my own butcher, and like, I'm not going to necessarily drill for the gasoline that goes in my vehicle, and all of these things. But I should know how to do a lot of things. Of course, I can't learn how to do everything, but like, I should learn how to fix my own plumbing, or grow some of my own food, build, whatever it is, change the oil in my car. Like, just, having enough capability that I could do it in a pinch, uh, makes you more resilient, almost by definition, right? Not that you're necessarily going to be doing it all of the time, but having kind of a broad spectrum of experience. So if you're not, if you're a chef and you're not necessarily always washing the dishes, you've done a lot of dishwashing, and so you can at least empathize with the dishwasher, right? And sometimes you might go in there and help out or something. Yeah, I mean, to me, there has to be some kind of balance, because we're not all going to do every single thing for ourselves. Like, I'm not going to make my own shoes and weave all of my own baskets and all of that stuff, right? Like, but I would like to learn how to do that stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Basic ability. Like,
Right,
not
awesome.
not that I'm going to be the best at it, but to get the job done in a pinch. I think is
Agreed. All right, Jason, it's been a lot of fun, and I thought it was really insightful, and I hope you enjoyed it as well.
I did. Yeah, thank you. This was really fun, Pedro. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Have a good evening.
Yeah, you too. Take care. Bye.